Hi, it's Brandon from Arabian Night Armory. Funny enough, I was working on a heater shield commission when one of my favorite YouTubers actually did a heater shield build. Um, Zena Alpha, ZNA Productions on YouTube. He's got a lot of good stuff on there. I am originally the intention of the video for today was going to be talking about what exactly you pay for when you're paying for a higher quality, like what distinguishes high quality from low quality fighting gear. Um, the reason why I'm also making this a reply to ZNA Productions is the shield, well, the shields in general, but this one in particular that he has aren't actually good for combat. So there's a specific reason for why I would say that they are dangerous, and because they are inherently dangerous not only to the user but to other fighters around them, that I personally would never pass that kind of shield. So what I do when I start is I try to get the best kind of plywood that I can get. Home Depot and Lowe's are kind of terrible. Menards is better. The main reason why you can see whenever you grab a piece of plywood is I got some here. So you look at the edge, right? There's a very clean edge. What you'll see with a lot of cheap wood from Home Depot or Lowe's is that there's gaps and voids. Those voids, there's nothing there. It's just air, right? So if you have holes in your shield, functionally that's what that is. That's not good. He uses Menards wood, so that's good. The next thing that I would do for making sure that I have a strong shield is I would grab some Titebond 2. This is wood glue, right? Now wood glue is somewhat flexible when it dries and it adds a lot of strength to the wood. The other thing that I do, super important for the historical, but also for durability, is I get a whole bunch of super heavy canvas. Whoops. I got a whole bunch of this stuff. And the canvas, you're supposed to put the glue down on the wood, and then you put the canvas on, and then you put another layer of glue on top of that, right? And what you want to do with your shield is you layer it front, back, front, back, front, back a couple times. You can't get away with just doing one on the front and calling it a day, even if it's thick. What this is doing is this is like a ye olde historical way of fiberglassing, but better. And the reason why I say it's better and I say don't use fiberglass is because it's a safety concern. Now, when this stuff dries, right, it's I can even peel it. It's similar to Elmer's glue, but a lot stronger, right? It's this flexible stuff. And if you compare that to fiberglass, that's glass. The epoxy crystallizes as it dries. Now, what this means is if you built a shield using fiberglassing, the epoxy resin from that fiberglass will end up causing micro tears inside your lungs as you breathe it. It's very, very damaging to the human lungs, or anyone's lungs for that matter, even if you're not human. Dogs, cats, pets are important. Damaging to lungs to inhale shards of fiberglass, dust of fiberglass, and it's for that reason that I would never want any shield to be made using any fiberglass, epoxies, or resins on the battlefield. Context, I'm fighting in armored combat. So presumably that would be a concern. Now, if you're a LARPer, then the foam padded latex stuff is not really going to impact the wood in a way that the fiberglass would even come out. But at the same time, then you wouldn't be fighting with that shield in the first place. Your shield would probably also be made of foam and latex on the outside. And the fiberglass would never be exposed to open air to be hit by another sword. But yeah, that's my main concern. Another reason why, related, so the shield that ZNA Productions has up right now is 1/4 inch, and obviously with that thinner kind of plywood you can shape it, and he's got a nice curve going to it. The problem is, historically, when you had 1/4 inch, that kind of thin style shield, that's when the lamination on front back with that wood glue on the canvas becomes extremely important. You can't at all get away with doing like one layer on the front or even 2 layers on the front and saying that that's it. You could get away with very few, even down to just 1 in front and back, maybe 2 in front and back. I would say do 2 if you have something like 1/2 inch or 3/8 inch, but 1/4 inch absolutely not. This one in particular, this is 1/2 inch, and I'm going to do, like I said, 1 2 1 2, front back alternating. And then what you'll also see on this shield is it's got that rope on the edge. So the purpose of putting rope on the edge of a shield is that whenever you're going to take hard impacts on there, that rope is going to dampen some of the impact before it reaches the wood of the shield. And then the way it's secured on there is using a special kind of glue that doesn't foam up. I always tell people this is bad, stay away from this, unless you know it's not going to cause issues, but it will cause issues in any kind of gear for armored combat. So the main reason why I say don't use Gorilla Glue, when this stuff foams up, and it dries, right? It becomes abrasive, and so all of those bubbles from the glue, they become rough surfaces when the bubbles break down, and then whatever you're Gorilla Gluing, that's going to get scratched up, almost like a sandpaper or like the teeth on a saw, and that's going to tear. And that's the main reason why you really don't want to use wood glue for anything. Or not, you don't want to use Gorilla Glue for anything. You want to use wood glue for wood stuff. It's very flexible. It's not going to cause that weird serration stuff when it dries. It doesn't foam. The other advantage of Titebond 2 specifically is that it's water resistant. So when you laminate multiple layers of that stuff on there, your shield will become pretty waterproof. I wouldn't recommend throwing it in the bottom of a pool for a couple days. That's probably terrible, even with Titebond 2. But if it rains, your shield's just not going to care. What you will see when you Titebond glue your shield in the laminations is that water just kind of beads off of it, almost like a car that's been freshly waxed. But yeah, that's a little bit on quality shield making and also concerns of safety for ZNA, because I really don't want him to end up in the hospital with cut up lungs because of the fiberglass dust or resin dust. That's a very bad thing. Related, what are you paying for when you pay for higher quality in armor? So one of the big issues that I see in armor that's made cheap from India or China, usually India, is that they don't really think about where they put their weld seams. So a weld seam could be on the visor, it could be right down the middle. And that concern is if you get smacked in the face with a sword, well, that weld seam's eventually going to pop open. So you definitely don't want that. The full visor has to be one solid piece of steel. If you don't have the capacity to make it one solid piece, what I would recommend is forge welding, as opposed to the modern welding. The difference is forge welding, you're heating up both pieces of steel and you're pressing them together, versus just heating up a seam. So a forge weld could create one homogeneous piece of steel from two originally separate pieces, and structurally, it's, as long as you do it correctly, it's perfect. Obviously, with welds, that modern way, there's a huge, not margin, what's it called, spectrum. There's a spectrum of good welds to absolutely terrible welds that are just burning steel. You can see a lot of groups on Facebook that have, it's intended to be light humor, but it might make people butthurt if their stuff is featured on there, but it's weld shaming. The thing is, weld shaming, it obviously exists, one, because it's a matter of skilled labor, and if you're getting paid for skilled labor, you should be skilled, but two, it's a safety concern. Now, if you look at a large object and it has a weld that half of the weld is good, but half of it's kind of spotty, the part that's good might be enough to hold it together until someone can touch it up later. The difference with armor is that that's directly over you, the wearer, your body. So if you have a bad weld seam over your ribs or over your face or anywhere on your armor, that body part now becomes extremely endangered if someone hits you there. So that's one difference in paying for higher quality stuff. And that's also why, if anyone wants to look into buying armor from me or anything, I will show you inside and outside what the armor looks like, so you can see that I don't have danger welds all over the place. That bothers me. Another difference you're paying for is the way that it articulates. Lots of cheap LARP armor, the way that they articulate is that they have two pieces of steel and then they'll have a strip of leather on the inside. Now that's not completely inaccurate. There are examples of that happening historically as far as armor design goes, but that should not be done across the board. There are some things where sliding rivets are a better option. And I believe I have my Gothic gauntlet here. So this would be an example of sliding rivets, right? So these rivets, the holes that they're in are not circular, they're oval, and that's what allows that nice flexion going on. And as I've mentioned on a previous video, like, you can't fit a blade in there whatsoever. So sliding rivets as much as possible, if that's historically accurate to the time period you are trying to depict, you really want that. If you're doing fantasy armor, I would still say to do it. I mean, hell, this is... What you can pretty clearly tell is that 15th century Gothic is a pretty pronounced influence on Lord of the Rings for some of the gauntlets that some of the villains were using. So, yeah, it's close to something historical, and it should and did, I think, use sliding rivets, and it looked great. Um, Another issue with cheap armor and why you want to pay for that quality is thickness. A lot of manufacturers from India tend to, what they'll do is they'll take a picture of some armor that's real. And when I say real, I mean it's the correct thickness, it's the correct alloy of steel, and then they'll take credit for that. And then they'll say that they're selling it for dirt cheap, right? And what you'll end up getting when you order it is something that is maybe half as thick or less, and it's not made of the right kind of steel, and that is hugely problematic. The helmet that I recently posted on my Facebook is 2.6 millimeters. That's basically 12 gauge. 20 gauge is like 1 mil, right? And 18 to 22 is roughly where a lot of Indian armors that are cheap that you find on the internet are going to be. So mathematically, that's literally less than 1/2 the thickness of what a helmet should be. So when you have helmets that are that thin, your concerns are obviously that 1, it's going to cave in, right? 2, you're going to pop a weld seam even faster. 3, it's just not going to pass. At least it shouldn't. That's why you should always be wary of the cheap armor that you find online. It can say SCA, for example, in the name, and it's not SCA approved. Always consult 1, the SCA handbook if you're going to look for SCA armor, and 2, consult another fighter who's been fighting for a couple years, or a field marshal, for those who are not in combat, that's like the referee. Consult them and ask them about what is and is not going to pass. But yeah, a 20 gauge helmet will never pass, period, for like anything except maybe cute latex larping. What you can get away with is 16 gauge. 16 is acceptable. 14 is what I would prefer for something like SCA heavy, and 12 is what I would absolutely demand for any kind of heavy armored combat with steel weapons. So now that SCA is starting to dabble in steel weapons instead of just rattan, I'd recommend to all the people that are experimenting with that for SCA, get a 12 gauge helmet. Doesn't have to be from me. If you want to get it from somewhere else, fine, but just get a 12 gauge helmet. Other things for quality of armor are the way that it fits to you. A lot of times gauntlets, with cheap gauntlets, they don't mind how long fingers are on a human body, which I think is silly because the person making it, presumably they have fingers, and yet they don't put them in the correct proportion when making the gauntlet. This is a really nicely made gauntlet, and what you'll notice, and I've mentioned it before, is that's exactly where my finger ends, and that's where my finger ends, and that's where my thumb ends, and very, very nicely fitted to my hand, very articulated. So this would be an example of good armor, right? It's good articulation, it doesn't have dangerous gapping that leaves me wide open, it's thick enough that it can take very heavy hits, doesn't have any dangerous weld marks at all anywhere on this. Riveted construction is honestly not necessarily better, but if you do a bad weld, it's going to break. And if you do one bad rivet, but you have 9 or 10 rivets that secure something together, the other 9 rivets will hold. Versus a weld seam, once part of that seam bursts open, the rest of it will eventually burst open as well. One last thing I would say about quality and what you're paying for when it comes to getting more expensive armor as opposed to cheap internet stuff. Historical accuracy. Now, someone mentioned for some reason, actually I should probably just get that back right now, someone suggested that this is a poor interpretation of Cherbourg gauntlets from the Cherbourg finding. No, this isn't trying to be that. This isn't trying to be any kind of Cherbourg gauntlet, it's just an hourglass gauntlet, right? And saying that is just silly. It makes me think like if I had my shoe and I showed someone my shoe and they're like, oh, that's a terrible interpretation of George Washington's shoes. And they're just shoes. They're not trying to be George Washington's shoes, they're just shoes. This isn't trying to be a Cherbourg museum find gauntlet, this is just an hourglass gauntlet. And structurally, nothing about the way that this is designed is out of place for the time period that's depicted. When you look at 14th, and I think late 13th century as well, as when they had a lot of hourglass gauntlets, if you had money, you would decorate it with the brass that's on here, and what you would also want for protection is that pyramid shaping on the foreknuckles, and you would want to have this nice range of motion. and it's all riveted to leathers that are then stitched to the glove. Like everything about this is historically correct. If this was set in a time machine to the 1400 or 14th century, so 1300s, 14th century, no one would think that this is strange. No one would think that this is alien or out of place. It looks fine, and that's, I guess, relating to a separate issue that I could do another video on, but like the nature of unjustifiable elitism. Elitism is inherently a bad thing in a lot of cases, especially when trying to get new people into a community, but unjustified elitism, where someone that just flat out doesn't know what they're talking about presents themselves as an expert, that is really bad. So don't do that. I'm not going to name the person who said that this was a Sherbert goal, because it's not trying to be that, but that is something that I'm going to say, like, understand that maybe you don't know everything about everything. But yeah, those are just some concerns for what you're paying for with high quality armor versus weird, jagged stuff you get online. I hope you guys stay safe out there when you're fighting.